My name is Angela Yao, and I'm an assistant professor at the National University of Singapore. I'm one of the co-organizers of this 3D geometric vision seminar. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce Gim Hee Lee. So Gim Hee Lee is actually my colleague here in the Department of Computer Science at NUS. And previously, he was a researcher at Mitsubishi Electric Research Labs before joining NUS. His PhD is in computer science from ETH Zurich. And so for the past decade or so, Gim Hee has been working on multi-view geometry for 3D mapping and also localization for autonomous vehicles and also for drones. And in the more recent years, he's been also working on deep learning for 3D computer vision related tasks. So tasks like 3D scene understanding and also human pose estimation. And so in our seminar series today, Gim Hee is going to talk about his works on non-strongly supervised learning for 3D vision. So with that, I would like to hand over the stage to Gim Hee. Please feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Okay, sure. I will share my screen now. So can you see the slides?
I see the slides. I need to open the stream maybe.
Okay, good. I guess I will use the full screen. Okay, great. So thank you, Angela, for the introduction. And as spoken that I will talk about my work on non-strongly supervised learning. Oh, it's on the wrong view, I think. But wait, how do I switch this? I think this is in the presenter.
I mean, I see your full slide, Gim Hee.
Yeah, okay. Let me fix this to this view. Here, I think this is better. Okay, I think there's a delay. Okay, so as mentioned that I will talk about the non-strongly supervised learning for 3D vision task. And so it's a well-known fact today that everybody is actually working, or most of the people in computer vision today, they are working on deep learning related tasks or to apply deep learning on many computer vision tasks. And because it has actually achieved a great success over the past few years. However, there's a very big bottleneck in many of these deep learning enabled tasks. And this is it's largely dependent on the availability of strong labels. For many 3D vision tasks, this is actually very difficult to obtain in large quantities. So the solution which we think that should be used to mitigate this bottleneck would be to use non-strongly supervised learning, such as self-supervised learning, weakly supervised learning, and semi-supervised learning. Of course, it's not limited to these three techniques. There are several other techniques which can be also classified under non-strongly supervised learning. So today, I'm going to talk about some of the 3D computer vision tasks which we try to apply non-strongly supervised learning on. I'll briefly talk about our work on 3D object detection, 3D keypoint detection, as well as 3D semantic segmentation and 3D human pose estimation. So I'll first talk about 3D object detection, which is published in our previous two works in ICCV 19 and CVPR 20. So the task of 3D object detection on RGB-D data is defined to be given a 3D point cloud, which can look something like this from a RGB-D data or sensor. The objective here is that we want to take this point cloud together with the RGB information and the points information, which is the XYZ, and we want to output the class of the object and place a tightest bounding box around each object in the scene. So they're all together one classification task that we need to do here. and as well as to do a regression of 7 parameters, which is the bounding box parameter around the object. And this is a very laborious and costly task to actually get the strong labels. So imagine that you have to get the labelers to manually place all these tightest bounding box, and also to identify the objects, the 3D objects that are in the scene, given this point cloud here. So it's very difficult for non-trained eyes to actually even to detect where are these objects, and not to even mention to place the bounding boxes correctly around these objects that are in the point cloud. So in order to mitigate this challenge of the need for strong labels, the main idea here is that in this particular work is that we perform what is known as the cross-category semi-supervised learning for 3D object detection. So the main idea is to transfer knowledge from what we define to be the strong class to the weak class. So strong classes are objects in the data sets that we are given with 2D as well as the 3D ground truth. So in this case here, an example would be, let's say I have chair and beds in my data set, and I'm given both the 2D and 3D strong labels for these 2 classes of objects. And I'm going to call this the strong classes. And during training, I won't see the strong labels for the weak classes, such as, for example, the table and the nightstands. I'm only given the 2D labels for these weak classes. But the task here is that I want to train the deep network such that on the strong classes as well as the weak classes, such that during inference time, it's also able to predict the 3D bounding boxes of the weak classes that are not seen, the strong labels that are not seen during the training. So our proposed method, which we call the transferable semi-supervised 3D object detection from RGB-D data, was published in ICCV 2019 by my ex-student Yu Xiang over here. And so basically, the network consists of a backbone branch over here, which we make use of the state-of-the-art at that time, which was the Froston PointNet on RGB-D data for 3D object detection. And in this backbone branch, we will supervise it using the available strong classes. So these are the usual supervision that we give to strongly supervised learning on 3D object detection. The instance segmentation loss on the Froston point cloud over here. So basically, this is just to mask whether the point cloud that we get from the Froston is a foreground or a background class. And we'll also put the 3D bounding boxes, the strong loss on the 3D bounding boxes over here. So this is also the standard loss that we place on the 3D bounding box, on the anchor box, as well as the regression of the adjustment on the bounding box parameters on the anchor boxes. So our main contribution here is that we add a pre-trained box PC feed network to the main backbone branch over here, such that we can actually supervise the transfer of the knowledge from the strong classes to the weak classes. So here, we just, the idea behind this is that we are training this box PC network to predict 2 things. The first output here is that we want it to, given the 3D bounding box, which is the predicted 3D bounding box from the main branch, as well as the input Froston point cloud, which we denote as X over here. We want to first predict the box correction. That means that denoted as delta B over here. That means that we want to predict this delta B, which we can use to correct the initial prediction that is given to this pre-trained box PC feed network, as well as a probability value over here. So this probability value P over here, it denotes the goodness of feed. This means that given this 3D bounding box, as well as the input 3D point cloud, we want to check whether this probability will tell us whether how good this 3D bounding box is going to be on the input point cloud. So we randomly perturb the strong classes over here because we are given the ground truth for the strong classes. we randomly perturb it to be to have a positive probability of the goodness of it and a negative probability on the goodness of it. And this means that we train it on the classification loss such that if the perturbation is good, it means that the bounding box is a reasonable bounding box for the input point cloud. We'll give it a high probability of 1. If it is a negative 1, we'll suppress it to become 0. As well as the regularization or the regression task over here, where we are going to predict delta, which is the perturbation that we give to the bounding box on the strong classes. So this is a regression, which we simply use a L2 loss over here to predict this delta. So this F box PC regression over here is actually to predict the delta or the delta B over here, which we can use to correct the predicted 3D bounding box. Now, once we have pre-trained this box PC fit network, we'll simply use it in the main branch together with the main branch, such that we maximize the goodness of it from the predicted bounding box that is given from the main branch on the weak classes. So this this particular probability here is actually the probability of the goodness of it from the previous slide as shown here. Now, in order to prevent the wrong prediction from the weak classes, we actually also introduce several regularization losses. The first one that we introduce is the relaxed reprojection loss. So from the prediction of each of these weak classes, we actually reproject it back onto the image, because we are also given a 2D image where we apply a 2D detector initially. And this green bounding box over here is the output from the 2D detector. So the reprojected 3D bounding box over here, we say that it must fall within a certain upper and lower bound between this particular 2D bounding box that is detected from the 2D detector. And in addition to that, we also prevent volume collapse. This to make sure that the volume that is predicted by the backbone branch over here, it doesn't collapse to a singular point. And as well as we also prevent large deviation of the scale of the 3D bounding box that we have predicted. So this average scale is actually obtained from, you can easily obtain it from some available data, which need not be the ground truth label that is corresponding to this respective point cloud that we are given for training. So here's some results on the Sun RGB-D data, where we can see that, so at that time, this Froston point nets was the only existing work or the few existing work on 3D object detection, but it's strongly supervised. We can see that in comparison to this Froston point net, which was the state of the art at that time, our box PC fit network actually achieved on a semi-supervised learning level, we actually achieved about 80% or 70 to 80% of the strongly supervised learning framework, which is considered quite good for a semi-supervised or a non-strongly supervised network at that particular time. And here are some qualitative results which we have shown on the Sun RGB-D data. And here we can see that although we use a semi-supervision, we can see that we also can detect reasonable results as compared to the fully supervised network of Froston point net. Here's some results on the KIDI data set. You can also see that we achieve about 70 to 80% of the compared to the strongly supervised learning network, which was FPN at that particular time. And here's some qualitative results which you can see on the detection of cars as well as pedestrians in the KIDI data set as compared to the fully supervised network. We can give some reasonable results over here. So one of the disadvantage limitation here is that we can also observe from here is that the rotation that is estimated from the semi-supervision from our framework, it's less precise compared to the fully supervised framework. This perhaps tell us that it's much more difficult to actually learn the rotation of the bounding box without strong supervision. So in our cross-category semi-supervised learning, which we have mentioned in the previous work, is that it's still, one disadvantage of it is that it still requires a large amount of 3D data for the strong classes. And furthermore, our method of the cross-category semi-supervised learning on RGB-D data, it relies on 2D detector as the input. So the question here is that, the obvious question here is that, can we actually do better? The answer is actually yes. So we tried what is known as the in-category semi-supervised learning on only 3D point clouds as the input. So in-category semi-supervised learning compared to cross-category semi-supervised learning is that in this particular case here, for every class of the object that we are interested in detecting, we'll give a few samples compared to a cross-category where we only give we give a lot of samples for the strong classes, and we don't give any samples, training samples for the weak classes. And here we propose our work, which we call SESS. It stands for Self-Ensembling Semi-Supervised 3D Object Detection, which was published in CVPR this year. This work was done by my student, Zhao Na, over here. And our SESS architecture is based on what we call the mean teacher framework. So basically, there are two branches in this particular framework. One is the student branch and one is the teacher branch. So the student branch will actually transfer the knowledge to the teacher using what we call the exponential moving average. So the first step to this SESS network is that we, out of all the labeled and the unlabeled data that we are given, we'll randomly subsample a subset of this data point and input it into our network. So in the student branch, we will randomly perturb the randomly sampled point clouds using a stochastic transform. So this stochastic transform is a random flipping along the x or y axis, or it could also be a random rotation around the upright axis. So once we have applied this transformation on the input point cloud, we'll input it to the student network. Then the next step would be to use the unperturbed 3D point cloud and input it into the teacher network concurrently. Then we will apply the supervised learning loss on those data points or those point clouds with labels. So here's how we do it. We first apply the same stochastic transform onto the transform labels. And then we will take this transform labels and compare it with the output of the student network. So here it should be self-consistent, or rather, after the transformation, this particular label should be consistent with the output from the student network that is from the input after the same stochastic transformation. Then the next thing that we do would be to get the output from the student network, from the teacher network, and apply the same transformation to this output that is obtained from the teacher network. And we apply 3 consistency losses here between both the labeled and the unlabeled output of the student and the teacher network respectively. Then here we propose 3 consistency losses here. The first loss that we propose is the center-aware consistency loss. So the idea behind this is that we want to minimize the alignment error between the teacher and the student network. So the teacher, where the student network, it's the input point cloud, it's where the stochastic transformation is applied to it before we input the point cloud into the student network. And in the teacher network, we'll input the original point cloud into the teacher network and apply the transformation after on the outputs of the teacher network. And here we want both of the outputs to be self-consistent with each other. And here we simply align this particular center loss here is to align the center of the bounding boxes that is predicted from the teacher and the student network. So since this alignment loss is not bijective, we will have two terms over here where CS, CT or CSA here is actually for every bounding box that is predicted from the teacher network, we find the closest center of the bounding box from the student network over here. The second loss that we apply here would be the class-aware consistency loss, where we want the closest aligned the bounding boxes predicted by the student and the teacher network to also predict the same class. Hence, we minimize the KL divergence between the probabilities of the student and the teacher network that is aligned in the previous loss. The next and the last consistency loss that we apply to the network would be what we call the size-aware consistency loss. So here, we want the bounding boxes the size of the bounding boxes that is predicted by the student and the teacher network to be aligned to each other, to be the same size as each other. And here we will simply minimize the square loss between the two sizes predicted by the closest student bounding box from the student network and the teacher network. Now, once we have done all these supervised and the consistency losses, we'll do backpropagation to the student network to update the parameter in the student network. And once this backpropagation and the update of the student network is done, we will transfer the knowledge from the student network to the teacher network using the exponential moving average technique over here. So here, we'll simply do a moving average of the student parameters and then transfer it to use it to update the parameters of the teacher network here. Now, here's the results of our SESS, comparing it with the fully supervised learning method, which is VoteNet at that time. And this is also our backbone network that we use in our semi-supervised learning technique. So where the blue bars over here represents the performance from the strongly supervised learning technique, and the red bars over here represents the increment in the performance from our technique compared to the existing fully supervised technique. So we can see that with all the percentage of the data that we give to our semi-supervised learning technique, we outperform the strongly supervised one in all aspects. And what's interesting here is that with only 50% labor available to our semi-supervised learning network, we can already reach similar performance with the 100% strongly supervised learning backbone network of this VoteNet over here. And here's some qualitative results on the Sun RGB-D dataset. We can see that compared to the 100% fully supervised training network, we can obtain reasonable results over here. And here's some qualitative results on ScanNet. We can again see that even with 30% labor on our data set, we can achieve comparable results with the 100% trained or the strongly supervised trained VoteNet as our comparison. Now, the second task that we work on is what we call the 3D keypoint detection network. And I will talk about the two previous work that was published in ECCV 2018 and ICCV 2019. So it's well known in the computer vision community that Keypoint Detector and Keypoint Descriptor works very well on images, even with handcrafted features. So SIFT is actually one of the most well-known Keypoint Detector and Keypoint Descriptor. And this allows us to find correspondences between two images taken from different viewpoints. And we all know that this is a very important step towards many computer vision or 3D computer vision related tasks, such as structure from motion, pose estimation, and many more other tasks in 3D computer vision. Now, the question is that given two point clouds that are taken from different viewpoints, can we also do the same thing? Because this is also very important for point cloud-based registration, such that we can actually take different scans and align them together to form the scan of a 3D model or even the environment. And this actually turns out to be kind of a difficult problem because of the lack of strong labels to get deep learning to actually work well on this particular task. So it's actually kind of challenging. Suppose that we are given all these point clouds without the ground truth labels over here. Even for human labelers, how am I going to tell which are the key points over here that are important or salient and remains invariant throughout the different viewpoint changes or different scene perturbation, for example. So we mitigate this particular problem by proposing the weakly supervised 3D FitNet. This was a work done by my student, Zijian, here, and it was published in ECCV 2018. So the solution to mitigate the need for strong labels for key points detectors, which are very challenging to obtain, is to use what we call the weak labels. So weak labels here simply refer to the approximate GPS or INS location of each point cloud, denoted as point PI here. So the point cloud here could be a segment of the point cloud from a scene as shown in this diagram here. So in order to fully utilize this in our weakly supervised learning framework, we'll first form training tuples over here, where we define the anchor point cloud here to be any randomly chosen segment of point clouds from the scene. So imagine that I mount a laser sensor or a scanner on my car, and then I go around the city to collect these point clouds and use the GPS INS to actually align them together to form the home map or the 3D model of the city. And now I segment it into many different small segments that look something like this. So I just need to randomly choose one segment and call it the anchor point cloud. And then I have to also form the positive point cloud to this anchor point cloud. So the positive point cloud, it could be a point cloud that is taken from another time, y, for example. And here, it is actually strongly encouraged that this positive point cloud to be taken from another time, because we also want to take into account, we want our network to learn the variation in the scene over time. But in this case here, the positive point clouds, it would have to be taken roughly at the same location as our anchor point cloud. So this can be given by the GPS INS location, and it need not be exactly the same location. In fact, this particular location over here, it has to have some errors given by the GPS and INS location. We also want our network to be robust against such error. And the next thing that we define would be a negative point cloud, which is a point cloud segment taken from a different time at a different location from the anchor point cloud. This different location can be given by the GPS and INS readings. Now, this is a network architecture of our 3D FitNet. The first step that we do would be to, given all these the tuples of the point clouds, the first step that we are doing would be to do clustering on the input point cloud with what we call the iterative furthest point. So these are we sample for representative points from the input point clouds. And then the next thing that we do would be to pass these clusters that we sampled from iterative furthest point into the detector network. So here, the detector network would output two things. The first thing, it would be attention weight, and the second thing that it outputs would be orientation. So this orientation is important because all the point clouds, it might be coming from in a form of different orientation. And this orientation is actually to undo this orientation and change it into all the point clouds change it into a canonical rotation such that we can actually extract a descriptor, which we can compare them directly. And of course, we'll pass this orientation that we have estimated from the detector network, as well as the input point clouds, the cluster that we have sampled from the iterative furthest point, into the descriptor network, and this will output the descriptor. This is essentially a vector which describes our key point that is detected from the first step. Then finally, we'll put all this into our alignment triplet loss. So basically here, for every key point that is detected and every descriptor that is detected from my anchor point cloud, I want to find the closest match of the descriptor from my positive point cloud. So this is given by this minimal, this particular vector over here. And then essentially I want to minimize the total sum of all these minimal distances, because I want the key point, the descriptors from the positive point cloud to be as close to the anchor point cloud as possible. We'll do the same thing for the negative and the anchor point cloud pair. We'll also find the minimum match over here, the best match over here. But now instead of minimizing these distances, we want to maximize this distance in our triplet loss. The reason is because we want to force the anchor point cloud to be as far away from the negative point cloud as possible. And then we'll weigh this triplet loss with the weights that we have learned, the attention weight that we have learned from the detector module over here. So essentially what this means is that the more salient the feature, will give it a higher weight. And some of the non-salient feature or the non-useful features will give it a lower weight that is predicted from the network, such that it will suppress this particular loss over here. Here's a comparison of our results from some of the existing techniques. And in fact, during that time, most of the existing techniques are handcrafted technique on 3D key point detector and descriptor. We can see that we outperform all the rest of the techniques in this graph over here. And what's interesting here is that comparing to the ISS key point, which was the state-of-the-art handcrafted feature key point detector at that time, we can see that our 3D FitNet actually ignores a lot of non-salient key points that can be found on the ground. These are non-discriminative key points, whereas ISS actually falsely detected all these key points to be useful key points. Now, here's a comparison on the Oxford robot car data set with existing techniques. You can see that we outperform all the other techniques. And we also do the same on the Kitty odometry data set. And we also outperform all the rest of the techniques over here. Here's a test of our key point detector, our 3D FitNet key point detector, to find correspondences between two different point clouds, where we actually use it for registrations afterwards. So we can, the red lines over here represents the key points that the correspondences that is detected from our 3D FitNet. And then this figure over here, it represents after we perform ICP, for example, on these correspondences, we can successfully register these point clouds together. And we can see that our technique actually achieves a better registration compared to the available or the existing handcrafted techniques of ISS plus the FPFH descriptor that was available at that time. So in 3D FitNet, we talk about using weakly supervised learning, where we still require some form of weak labels, and in that case, it's actually the GPS and INS reading. And very often, this GPS and INS reading would require expensive setup to actually, you need to mount this GPS and INS sensor on your vehicle. And these are expensive setup that not many people can actually afford to get it. So the question here is that, can we actually do better than weak supervision? So instead of using any labels over here, and the goal is to still the same thing, which we want to detect highly repeatable and accurately localized key points from the 3D point clouds without any use of ground truth training data, not even the GPS and INS reading in the form of the weak supervision. So here, we propose what is called the unsupervised stable interest key point detector, or in short, the USIP, which was done by my ex-student Jia Xing over here. And in this case, we totally do without any form of labeling, not even the weak form of labeling. So in this case here, we actually use what we call the self-supervision in order for the network to learn how to detect salient key points or useful key points here. Now, the key idea behind USIP is actually very simple. So given a point cloud, or any point cloud object that is shown here, denoted by X over here, we'll first input this particular point cloud into our feature proposer network. And the output of this would be a set of key points on the input point cloud that is given to the feature proposer network. So concurrently, we will also randomly perturb this or randomly transform this input point cloud X by a randomly generated transformation in the SE3 space into X tilde over here. And then we'll put this particular randomly perturbed point cloud into the FPN as well. And this will give us a set of key points in this from the outputs of our network over here. Then the next thing that we will do is that we will undo this particular transformation on the set of detected key points from the randomly transformed input point cloud X tilde. And here, what's interesting here is that because these are the same point and we are same object over here, and we know that we randomly transform it using some form of SE3 transformation, we can actually undo this transformation on the detected key points over here. And the key points that is after the undoing of this transformation, it should match up with the key points that is detected from the original input point cloud over here. So we are introduced two losses in order to supervise this particular network. Now, a straightforward way to minimize the difference between the detected key points before and after the transformation is simply to use what we call the Chamfer loss. And however, the problem with this Chamfer loss is that it actually gives equal saliency or equal weightage to all the point clouds. But in our case here, because we are talking about key point detector, so some of the key points that is detected by our network might not be equally salient compared to the others, or might not be equally useful and discriminative compared to the others. So here, what it means is that the Chamfer loss is not so ideal in handling such cases. So in order to overcome this problem, we introduce what is known as the probabilistic Chamfer loss, where we, in addition to the key point detector from our feature proposer network, for every key point that is detected, we also add in some variance, a variance. This variance over here simply tell us the uncertainty of the key points that we are that is detected from our feature proposer network from the input point cloud, and we'll model this uncertainty or this particular distribution using exponential distribution between the detected key points from the original input point cloud and the point cloud after the transformation. And this leads to what we call the probabilistic Chamfer loss. So intuitively, we can think of it this way, that the sigma over here, the uncertainty over here, is to actually weigh or to balance the Chamfer loss between how certain we are for a given detected key point. Now, it's not just sufficient to enforce the probabilistic Chamfer loss, because in this particular case here in our USIP, in comparison to our previous work on 3D FitNet, where if you still recall that in the 3D FitNet, we actually enforce the key points to be in the point cloud. This means that the key point, because of the randomly sampled points from the IPS, from the iterative IFS, from the iterative furthest point sampling, and in this case, the key points are actually subjected to a certain quantization error, and this is not good. So this would lead to a drop in the performance. So in order to overcome this problem, in our USIP here, we avoid the sampling from the point cloud, the input point cloud directly, and we allow our feature proposer network to predict any key points anywhere in the 3D space. But after we relax this choice, what will happen is that the key point that is predicted from our FPS might be too far away from the input point cloud, the surface of the input point cloud. So in order to overcome this, we introduce the point-to-point loss that penalize any key point that is detected from our feature proposer network to be too far away from the input point cloud. Now here's the qualitative results to show you with and without the point-to-point loss. We can see that without the point-to-point loss, the network tends to predict key points that are floating in the air over here. But with the point-to-point loss, we can see that the key points that is detected tend to be on the given input point cloud. Here's some experimental results that we have performed on 4 open source dataset: Kitty, Oxford dataset, the Redwood, as well as the ModernNet 40 dataset. We evaluate on 2 evaluation criteria: the repeatability as well as the distinctiveness of the key points. So here's some plots that we show on the 4 data sets here, and we can see that our USIP significantly outperform all the existing techniques, including 3D FitNet on all these 4 data sets. And here's some results on the registration failure, as we have shown in the 3D FitNet. We can see that USIP has a lowest rate of percentage of failure in the registration compared to all the other existing techniques. And interestingly, USIP also outperforms 3D FitNet, which already has quite a low registration failure rate over here. Now, the next thing that I'm going to talk about, the next task that I'm going to talk about is the 3D semantic segmentation task. So where we actually published this work in CVPR this year. So 3D segmentation or 3D semantic segmentation task widely encompasses 2 different subtasks, where the first one would be what we call the 3D shape segmentation. And this particular task over here is that given a point cloud of a shape, of an object, of a 3D object model that looks something like this. For example, in this case here, this is a chair. The task is that we want to segment this input 3D point cloud of the object into the different semantic parts. So this could be the backrest, this could be the seat, and this could be the legs of the input point cloud over here. And similarly, you can have many other different objects. What we want to do here would be to segment them into different semantically meaningful parts from the 3D shape. And this would usually require 1,000 points to about 10,000 points labels for the strongly supervised learning network to work well. And the second task that the second subtask of 3D semantic segmentation would be what we call the 3D indoor scene segmentation. It could also be outdoor, but in this case here, we only tried it on the indoor scene. And so in this case, what we are given would be the 3D point cloud of the whole scene instead of an object compared to the previous subtask here. So now we are given this 3D point cloud of the whole scene. The next thing that we want to do is that we want to assign labels, semantic labels to every point cloud, to every input point cloud, such that we know the semantic meaning or the semantic classes of each one of these point cloud in the real scene. For example, here where we are given a scene in the pantry, what we want to do here is that for every point from the input point cloud, we want to assign it a label on whether this belongs to a wall, this belongs to a ceiling or the ground or any other object that is in the scene. And typically, because the 3D scene segmentation involves the whole scene, the number of points that we are given, it's actually increased drastically compared to the 3D object detection, 3D object semantic segmentation task. And in this case here, the number of points that we usually require or labels that we require would be on the order of millions of points. And in both these tasks, it's actually very challenging for any manual labeling to take place. Because imagine that you are given these point clouds or any point cloud on the object level. What we want to do here is that we want to label every single point in this 10,000 points or 1,000,000 points to take one out of K classes. And this is pretty much challenging to do. So in order to resolve this particular challenge here in the tedious labeling of every single point in the point cloud for semantic segmentation, we propose the weakly supervised semantic point cloud segmentation. And what we showed in this particular work here is that, interestingly, even with as low as 1 point label per class in the 3D point cloud, we can actually show comparable performance to 100% fully supervised learning network here. And here's the architecture of our weakly supervised 3D semantic segmentation work. So it consists of 4 different branches over here. The first branch is what we call the incomplete supervision branch. Given the point cloud, what we train a network to extract the features and to transform this into the set of point embeddings. So there's one embedding per point in the n number of point clouds over n number of points in the point cloud. Then the next thing to do here is that we will apply softmax cross entropy on all the points with available labels. So because this is a weakly supervised learning, we are given a very few points which is labeled in the point cloud. So we'll apply this on using the softmax cross entropy loss, where M over here is the mask to tell us whether the strong labels exist for that particular point or not. And the second branch that we use to weakly supervise our network is what we call the Siamese branch. So essentially what this means is that given that particular point cloud, I will first extract the point embedding for this original point cloud. And then I will subject this input point cloud to a certain rotation or mirroring around the XY axis. And then I'm going to input this into the same encoder network. And essentially, this is just equivalent to data augmentation and randomly perturbing the input point cloud with some form of transformation. But since they are the same point cloud, the features that is being extracted from these 2 different point clouds, they are going to be the same. So we are use the L2 distance to measure the divergence and minimize this divergence, minimize the differences between the features that is extracted from these 2 sets of point clouds. The third supervision branch is what we call the inexact supervision branch. So this branch here, the supervision is inspired by what we call the multi-instance labeling, which is a very common technique used in weak supervision for image-based segmentation or object detection tasks. And here, essentially what here it means is that instead of labeling, instead of having a task to label every single point in our input point cloud to belong to one out of K classes, we say that we are going to label, we are going to train a classifier such that it tells us the point cloud wise or the point clouds level classification, whether in this particular input point cloud it contains that part, it contains a table, a ceiling, for example, and this would be the point cloud level supervision. So in this case, we do not need every point to be labeled. We just need a subset of the points or a very small number of the points in each class to be to have an available label. So we'll apply softmax on this or the max pooling, sorry, on the available data, on the available ground truth data, and then we will train the network such that it outputs the point cloud wise labeling compared to this particular ground truth labels that we have obtained from max pooling. Now the fourth branch that we have would be the smoothness branch here. So essentially, what we want to achieve on the smoothness branch is that we want to for any 2 points which are neighboring points spatially arranged in spatially, they are very close together. We want to encourage them to take the same label. So here, that's why we say that if there are neighboring points, which is closest to we detect this, compute this using the nearest neighboring or the k nearest neighbor algorithm, and we want to enforce them to be smooth, to take the same label. And in addition to that, we also want to encourage the 2 points with the same color. If we are given this information during training, we also want to encourage them to take the same label if they have the same color over here. Now here's the experimental results which we evaluate on the ShapeNet dataset for the 3D shape segmentation problem. And we can see that comparing this with the where we use the encoder of .NET++, compared to full supervision here, even with 1 point weak supervision, this means that every part in the input point cloud, we are only given 1 point. We can actually achieve comparable results to the fully supervised setting over here. And with as low as even 10%, we can actually improve the results by quite a bit over here. And here we also test it on our network on the PartNet dataset. This is a new dataset at that time, and we can see that comparing to the full supervision, even with 10% labeled data, as our network already achieved kind of a close performance to the fully supervised learning network. And here's some qualitative results on the 3DIS scene segmentation. So essentially, this is given the point cloud of a scene, we want to label every point to take a certain class over here. And here we also show some results, qualitative results on the ShapeNet part segmentation. We can see that in our case over here, even with 1 point supervision, we already reach some we already reach results that are very close to the ground truth qualitatively over here. Now, I'm going to talk about the last task that we are working on, which is the 3D human pose estimation, which we apply weak supervision to design a generative network for multiple 3D human pose estimation. So for 3D human pose estimation, it's a very challenging problem. So essentially what we want to do here is that given a 2D image, we want to leave this 2D image which contains a human inside there, and we want to leave this 2D the skeleton pose of the human into the 3D structure or the 3D pose of the human that is seen in this particular image. And we know that this is actually a very ill-posed problem, because ill-posed meaning that because from 3D, when we project to 2D, we all know that the depth is missing. And this is a non-invertible projection. which means that from 2D, given 2D, to retrieve or to recover the 3D structure, we are missing a lot of information from here. And in addition to being a ill-posed problem, this is also an inverse problem where, because of the ambiguity in the depth, so suppose, for example, this particular point that we see on the 2D image over here, the 3D counterpart could actually lie anywhere on this light ray over here. So this is actually what we refer to as an inverse problem. So what it means here is that there could be more than one feasible solution to this particular problem of lifting 2D to 3D human pose. And in our previous work here, we show that we can actually mitigate this problem by, instead of getting the network to estimate one single 3D human pose estimation, which can easily overfit to the training data, we make use of what we call the mixture density network to estimate multiple 3D human poses from a single image over here. So we can see that in this case here, in our mixture density network, we actually estimate 5 hypotheses per input image, and where all of them actually reprojects to almost the same 2D reprojections, which shows that the inverse problem actually exists. However, this existing work that we proposed in CVPR 2019 last year is strongly supervised. So what this means is that during training, we will still require the training data with 2D to 3D correspondences. This means that for every image that we are given, we need to have the corresponding 3D ground truth that it's often very difficult to label. So in this recent work, we mitigate the problem of the availability of the strong label data with weak supervision, and but at the same time, we also want our network to be able to generate the multiple 3D human pose hypothesis in order to overcome the inverse problem which I have described earlier. So this work was published in BMVC this year, and it was done by my student Li Chen, shown here. So the rough idea here is that we want to train a model, a generative model, which we call Q here, to generate multiple samples of the 3D pose hypothesis, and where we are conditioned upon that we are given the input 2D image of or 2D skeleton pose of the human, and a random vector, a random latent code Z, which we actually draw from a normal distribution over here. And given these two as the input, we want our generator network here to output the 3D human pose, or to output multiple 3D human poses. Each one of them correspond to a unique random sample that we draw from the normal distribution. Now, this is the network architecture to achieve this particular task here. The first loss that we enforce would be the 2D reprojection loss. So given the input 2D human skeleton, as well as a random code that we draw from the normal distribution, we want to train this generator here to output Y, which is the 3D human pose estimation. And we'll also concurrently, at the same time, estimate the camera projection matrix, which we call M over here, from the input 2D skeleton pose as well as the image. And then we will apply this camera projection matrix on the estimated 3D skeleton pose to reproject it onto the 2D image, which we will compare it with the input 2D skeleton pose. So we want these two to be minimized. This means that all the reprojection, or all the estimated 3D poses that we have, it should be consistent with the input 2D poses when it's reprojected onto the image plane. Now, in order to encourage our generative network to give very diverse pose hypothesis, we also enforce the regularization of the diverse post-hypothesis losses over here, where this loss, we will maximize this particular loss over here, where it simply says that given two random vectors that is drawn from the normal distribution here, we want the post that is estimated from, or that is generated from our post generator from these two different random codes over here to be as diverse as possible. We don't want it to be similar. We want to maximize the differences between the post that is generated by these two these two input latent codes from the post generator. So this, as a result, you will enforce diversity in our generative network here. Then the next thing, we will also want to prevent mode collapse in our generative network by enforcing what we call the reconstruction loss. So essentially, what this means here is that we want to prevent many-to-one mapping. So we want to enforce one-to-one mapping over here, in other words, which means that we want to minimize the difference between the latent code that we have drawn and the inversion of the output from the post generator, which is denoted as G here. We pass it through an encoder to invert this output back into the latent code. And we want these two latent code to be as close to each other as possible. This actually enforces one-to-one mapping from the latent code to the output of our post generator network. Then finally, we apply the adversarial loss, which is in this case here, it's actually a maximum mean discrepancy loss, where this loss actually try to minimize the expected mean of from the samples P and Q that from our real and generated distribution respectively. So this enforce the two distribution, the two output distribution from our post generator, and a set of samples that we are given of the real poses to be as close to each other as possible. Now here's some results on the human 3.6M data set, where we can see that here ZC over here represents zero coding. This means that we actually get the best hypothesis from our generator network by sampling from the Z, by taking the sample, drawing a sample of Z from that corresponds to the maximum peak of the normal distribution, which we call the zero coding. And we can see that it achieved quite a good performance. It actually outperforms the state-of-the-art weakly supervised, but this is state-of-the-art. But this particular work is it doesn't consist of, it doesn't output multiple hypotheses. We can see that we actually outperformed this particular network over here by quite a huge margin. And we can also see that we can apply mean shift to get the on all the samples that is drawn from our network to get the best post hypothesis. And this achieves an even better result on protocol 1 for the human 3.6M dataset. And on protocol 2, we can see that our result is comparable, or it's actually it is actually better than the existing weakly supervised networks that is on protocol 2 over here. Here's some other results that we perform on the MPI in 3D PHP dataset, as well as the MP2 dataset. So in this case here, we can see that our network actually gives comparable results to the weakly supervised network on the percentage correct key points, or otherwise known as the PCK measure over here. And here's some qualitative result on the MP2 dataset that we can see that the 3D human pose that is estimated from our network is it's actually reasonable given all these 2D images as the input. So in conclusion, I have talked about the several tasks where we can actually apply weak or non-strongly supervised learning to get promising results. So, but however, one thing that I wish to emphasize is that this non-strongly supervised learning thing is still far from being solved, because we can see that a lot of the tasks that I have shown on the 3D learning, we still cannot reach comparable performance or even outperform the strong supervision. So here, the conclusion is that there is still a long way to go, and I hope that the community will actually look or place more emphasis on this particular line of work, so such that we hope that we can see very promising results or even very good results compared to the strong supervised learning in the future. Okay, that's all for my talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gim Hee, for that very interesting talk. So for those of you guys who joined midway into the stream, we saw a lot of different tasks in 3D computer vision, 3D object detection, keypoint detection, semantic segmentation, and also human pose estimation. And under these different tasks, Gim Hee presented several works and methods that can be learned without strong forms of supervision, but still perform quite competitively, both to other strongly supervised works, and also sometimes even perform almost competitively to strongly supervised works. So I would like to open up so actually the chat is already open. So if you guys have questions for Gim Hee, I would be happy to have a Q&A session now. So to start with, we already have one question here, Gim Hee. So from Kai, who asks, for your work on 3D segmentation, is it because of the connectivity information and also the idea of having homogeneous 3D structures that it's possible to use only one labeled point per class to achieve the performance that you do?
Yes, I think that's a very good insight here. The answer is actually yes, because in 3D structures, you get this, you get the XYZ coordinate, which can actually give very strong information of the discontinuity or some form of the shape information of that particular 3D object or the scene. So this actually helps very strongly in regularizing the 3D segmentation result compared to 2D image segmentation, where everything lies on a plane. So in the image, you don't get this kind of information there.
Okay, so while we're waiting maybe for some other questions from the audience, I have a few questions of my own also. So maybe let's start with something more general. So, I mean, we've also seen, let's say, machine learning methods applied in computer vision, which also use other forms of, which do not rely on strong forms of supervision for many other tasks as well. So do you think that this, the success of these methods now has something to do with the fact that our current machine learning algorithms are not really able to fully leverage this entire set of data? Or do you think there's something inherent within 3D data itself that you're presenting that you can attribute the success of your methods to?
So as I think the main thing that, if you have noticed, several of the works actually follows almost the same trick that we are using. We are leveraging on the 3D transformation here, which is actually missing in 2D. Actually, I would say that it's more difficult to do on 2D. Because the transformation in 3D is just living in the SE3 space. So we can actually very precisely, after the perturbation, after the random transformation in the SE3 space, we can make use of this information to enforce the consistency. But in the 2D space, what we are subjected to would be a general transformation in terms of in the homography space. And this is actually very ill-constrained. So we don't know how that whole thing is projected because of the different views, right? So in 2D, I think that although there are many techniques that are already shown some level of success there, generally these parts here is, I mean, this constraint that we use in the 3D non-strongly supervised learning techniques is not applicable to the 2D case. And I would say that much of the success that we've seen from it on the 3D task is actually coming from this particular constraint.
So we should all be working more in 3D rather than 2D then, right?
That's a good question. I actually don't think so, because some of the things that we are working on, for example, the 3D human pose estimation, right? We're actually doing a two-stage estimation. If you have noticed that the input to this is actually the 2D detection. Yeah, so that's the importance of important part of the 2D detection, right? And I think that there could also be way to leverage on the outputs of 2D detection or any 2D task. For example, you can first do 2D semantic segmentation and perhaps fuse it together with the 3D semantic segmentation task on the RGB-D data, for example. And even for the first work that I've mentioned, although it's 3D object detection, it's on RGB-D data, you can see that it actually depend hugely on the first step, where on the input of the 2D object detector, which is actually from a 2D classifier or 2D object detector, right?
Okay.
So it's still important. I wouldn't say that it's not important.
I see. So Alberto asks if you have any thoughts on working with meshes without strong supervision.
Working on meshes, yes, I think that this would probably have the same concept as 3D point cloud, except for we just need to reparameterize the input and the output space according to the meshes, instead of what we are using right now, which is a point cloud, which is actually simpler to model. But I suspect that in the mesh space, you might have more constraints over there, because you can actually apply the regularization on the meshes better than treating every single point in the 3D representation independently, which is actually what we are doing right now.
I see. Does that mean then that you think we need some better data structures to give some in-between representation between fully independent 3D points, which is the case of point clouds, versus meshes, which we already have linked all of these points together as with vertices?
Yes, I think that's a good question. I think that this is true, but there's always a trade-off, right? I mean, treating everything independently as what we are doing right now in the point cloud, this actually reduces the computation complexity, or the complexity in terms of the whole algorithm or for the whole network design. But the trade-off is that you might end up with less constraints and leading to a drop of performance. But of course, there's nothing stopping us from designing data structures that is super complicated, such as meshes or some other form of representation of the 3D surfaces. But the question is that when you have such a complicated parameterization of the input and output space, your network would also have to be consequently more complicated in order to be able to handle this kind of computerization, right? So I don't know, like this might actually lead to more computation and more complex design. So there's a trade-off. So which one do you want? The more complicated design, more complex computation, or a better performance? So we will have to choose one, right? I mean, we have to balance between these two.
I see. So there's a couple more questions that popped up. So from Kai, who asks again, he's asking if maybe this is even a little bit more controversial. Do you think 3D pose estimation is outperforming 2D pose estimation because there's no occlusion, so to say?
This is a interesting question. I wouldn't want to draw a conclusion here, but from what I observed in the past few years, right? I mean, at least in the community, 2D estimation or a single human 2D estimation it seems to be pretty much saturated. So I don't see any fancy new work, at least in the past 3 years or 4 years, right? But there are many work in the 3D human pose estimation. But I don't know whether is this due to the case of whether the performance that generally in the community, everyone is very satisfied with the current state-of-the-art performance for 2D estimation, which implies that this might be a fully solved problem. I don't know whether is this true or not, but the case, the situation that we are observing right now is that there are very few work, or I would say that almost there's no new work in the past few years on 2D pose estimation, but there are quite a number of works on 3D pose estimation. And in fact, one observation for the 3D human pose estimation is that quite a number of work in the past few years actually focus on non-strong supervision. So this could also mean that people start to identify that or start to acknowledge that although the good results from deep learning, it's actually largely attributed to the fact that they are all learning from a huge amount of data, which might not be easily accessible. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to comment on this question. I mean, I don't know this idea of having no occlusion. I guess this is depending on whether you see it as occlusion from the observation or from the actual model, right? So from an observation point of view, where especially in the human pose estimation, often the input data is monocular, right? So there is still occlusion in that sense. It's just that
so the occlusion, because what we are trying to do here is to leave 2D to 3D, right? So the occlusion is still there. I mean,
exactly.
that's why I wouldn't say that it's due to the occlusion. I mean, unless you are talking about like given but even with ground truth, occlusion is still going to be a problem, because ultimately what we want to train the network to learn is from a 2D image, which might already contain some occlusion, to actually infer the 3D structure. So actually 3D pose estimation with occlusion on 2D images is much more challenging than to do 2D detection on 2D images with occlusion. Because in that case, right, in the 2D case, we can actually just omit out the 2D joints that we are interested in detecting if it is occluded, right? But in 3D, I think it's going to be kind of challenging if you are, let's say your joint is occluded in the 2D input space, in 2D input image. And what you want to do is that you want to actually predict the three corresponding 3D joint from nothing, from given that you have you don't even see that thing in the 2D image. So this is probably the opposite of what this question is trying to say. I don't think it's because of the occlusion that 3D estimation outperform 2D estimation here. Yeah.
Okay, so Abhinav asks if your mixture networks will help in monocular 3D object detection and also RGB-D 3D object detection.
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, I think, but we haven't really tried this out. So I would suppose that this is a yes, because mixture density network, if you look at it this way, that it's actually trying to prevent overfitting. So in the case where we train the network to output only one particular output, given all the training data set, which tells you that there should be a hard ground truth that there's a one-to-one correspondence between the input and the output. But in the case where we are working on images where we know that there's a projective ambiguity, so we know that there's an inverse problem that exists. So that means that the 3D pose or the 3D object location that we are trying to detect from 2D images, it can lie anywhere on this particular light ray. So as long as it's an inverse problem, I think that mixture density network might help a lot here. But in the case of the point cloud, I'm not too sure about that because you would already have the metric scale. That means that we are given the point cloud in the exact scale. So there won't be this ambiguity in the inverse that exists in the inverse problem for a 2D to 3D kind of estimation. Yeah.
Okay. So I think we're almost drawing to the conclusion time of our scheduled stream. So if there are no other questions from our audience, then Gim Hee, I'd like to thank you again for speaking in our seminar series. And for everybody who is watching right now, I hope you guys tune in. Next week, we will have another speaker lined up to give another talk. And thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you.